I felt this very weird disconnect. I felt like my identity was completely unclear to me, not in alignment with how I felt. Primarily cultural norms, religious norms, oppressive norms. That was our safe bubble. When we were at home with those friends, it was all good. It was just us. We were ourselves. And the moment we went into society, then we'd have to sort of adhere to those standards. When we would visit our uncles' houses, the women and men were segregated. The men ate first, the women ate after them. How can I not have that choice? There are still a lot of an unbelievable amount of women that still live under these impositions. Even in the countries where these laws are changing a little bit, there's still that mentality that does not go away. You have to have that guardian permission from your guardian, an official letter notarized that your guardian says you are allowed to travel. You have to take that to the airport with your passport and your visa and whatever that is. It's hard to be the first in these situations because you're bringing shame to the family, or you're going against the grain, and it causes a lot of cleaning up for them.
If we're going to keep on pretending that it's a religious choice and some people want to do it and some people don't, then we're not speaking the truth. And then that will leave room for people to come in and be like, no, it's totally my 9-year-old daughter's choice to wear this, right? Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Yasmin Mohammed podcast. Today we have another Yasmine, but she's going to go by Jasmin. She goes by Jasmin now. Jasmin was born to an Arabian father and an Italian mother in Saudi Arabia. She was raised in fundamentalist Islam, and she started wearing the burqa in her tweens. She would get into verbal altercations with the religious police in Saudi Arabia, who monitored everyone and would harass, beat them with canes, and even take women to jail if they didn't comply. Jasmin experienced segregation in all aspects of her life and did not even own her own ID card as a woman because she belonged to her guardian male. From childhood to adulthood, when Jasmin traveled to Italy to visit her mother's family, she would see and experience the opposite side: modern, progressive, liberal, Western lifestyle. She wrote a memoir called The Last Sandstorm, where she shares this unusual and challenging upbringing that led her to her dramatic escape to the United States in 1999, where she earned degrees in sociology, creative writing, public policy, and ethical leadership. Amazing. Jasmin, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me, Yasmin. I'm so excited. Everyone has been asking me how we have never crossed paths. So this is really a long-standing thing for me also. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I think I came across your interview on Cults to Consciousness, which I adore that channel. They're if you're not familiar with that channel, you guys definitely go check them out. So yeah, I've known them for a while, and I was on their channel one time and I saw an ex-Muslim woman. How do I not know her? She wrote a book. So that's why we reached out. And so I'm really glad to have you here.
Thank you.
There's so much to talk about. You and I were chatting before starting this, and we actually were a little bit late starting because we have so much to talk about. So we're not going to be able to cover everything, but we're going to try our best to cover as much as we can. But let's start with your childhood. So you were talking about your mom is Italian and your dad is Saudi Arabian. What was that like growing up in Saudi Arabia? Were you considered to be like, did they see you as an American? Did they see you as a Saudi? Did they treat you as a Saudi like everybody else, or did they treat you like a foreigner? How did it affect your self-identity, and did it make you feel like you didn't really belong in neither Saudi Arabia nor Italy? Like, tell me what it was like to grow up with these two identities.
Yeah, so the challenging piece of that upbringing was the fact that we were growing up, my siblings and I, and other kind of, friends who were along the same lines as us. We're the first generation of these bicultural children in Saudi Arabia. So the extreme of knowing that your parents were different and you were growing up in these very, very polar opposite cultures, added to that was the fact that we had nothing that we could look up to that was role modeling this particular journey or this path. So it was really bizarre in the sense that We knew where we were growing up. There was, a very specific way of living. It was different from anything we'd seen anywhere else because we wouldn't see it in movies, we wouldn't see it in TV, we wouldn't see it in any other, in books, in fairy tales, and, fiction. None of what we were living every day was represented or mirrored anywhere else in the world. So there was that piece that was from the very early age, you're like, something's off here, and I'm not quite sure what it is. And then there was the piece of traveling, right? And going to the West and Europe, and primarily Europe, because my mom being Italian, that's where we ended up traveling every year. There was this kind of like, whoa, this is a whole other world. And this is mirroring what we see in movies and TV shows and reading in books and all of that. So for me, specifically for me, I felt this very weird disconnect. I felt like my identity was completely unclear to me. I knew in my heart what I felt, but I also then had to go against mentally, obviously not outspokenly, but mentally this idea that most of what was being told to me or fed to me felt so not in alignment with how I felt, primarily cultural norms, religious norms, oppressive norms, all of those pieces where as women we are now kind of trying to navigate and figure out first as young girls and then as women as we matured. So I always knew something was different and off. My mom obviously spoke, a different language, and at home we spoke my mother's language. We all grew up speaking Italian, my siblings and I. But my mom also learned Arabic, but her Arabic obviously sounded like a foreigner. So I knew she didn't belong in the same way other women and other mothers of kids that I went to school with. Um, I never felt a sense of belonging in Saudi Arabia because we were definitely seen as the others, the Westerners, the halfies, just kind of these oddities. In Italy, that wasn't the same issue. I mean, of course, some of our friends in Italy enjoyed the fact that we were exotically Arab or that we were half Arab, but since we spoke Italian and we immersed ourselves in the culture very comfortably. Even today, when I go to Italy, I'm at home. And that's probably the only place in the world where I never felt that I was looked at like I was different. Because I feel that even here in the United States, there's always something odd about, kids like me who grew up biculturally, from very vast different cultures and intellectually also somewhat navigating and figuring things out, that third culture child syndrome. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell that initial sensation.
Can you give us any stories, like share any experiences that can sort of illustrate that?
Oh yeah, for sure. So I went to a private school, and the school that I went there from first grade all the way to 12th grade. And the private school that I went to at the time was kind of the most prominent school in Riyadh, specifically the capital where I grew up. And at that school, many of the kids from the royal family attended, many kids from rich and noble families. So it was an interesting place because a lot of the kids like me who were half and half had fathers that were very kind of intellectual that studied abroad and had these Western wives, our moms. And so we had kind of the opportunity not to have to go to public school. Now, public school in the United States is a little different because it's a little more standard. I think in the United States, there isn't that big differentiation between public school and private school in terms of the education. Maybe, I mean, maybe now not as much,
Yeah,
but
there is.
but there isn't like the stigma of kids going to public school if they're, from good families or wealthier. None of that. In Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, especially at the time, there was definitely a huge stigma between public school, which was like for a specific criteria of people, specifically intellectually or academically, and socioeconomically. But in the school where I went, I had my kind of group of friends that were like me. And so we hung out a lot together, oftentimes speaking our other language together, whether it was Italian or usually English, because our friends who were half American kind of had, dominance over the language. And so we'd speak English together. And so all the Saudi girls that were exclusively 100% Saudi definitely looked at us a little differently. And I remember we were in class one time, and this was in middle school, and the teacher was trying to illustrate a math problem. She was talking about fractions. And so she was like, all right, if we take a percentage of girls here doing such and such. And so that was kind of the fraction that she was trying to work with. And she said, percentage wise, if we put all the Saudi girls on this side and all the Arab non-Saudi girls on this side, and which technically that's what we had was Saudi girls and Arab non-Saudi girls. There weren't any Western non-Arab kids in this school because it was an Arabic speaking school. We had international schools for the kids who weren't Arabic speaking. So the minute the teacher made that distinction and we were sort of sifting ourselves in our categories, I, along with a friend of mine who was half Dutch and half Saudi, moved to the Saudi section. And one of the girls stood up and said, no, Jasmine and Arwas should be moving to another category because they're not technically fully Saudi. If we're looking at percentages and we're looking at fractions, they're not fully Saudi. And I was like, excuse me? Like, that's my nationality. That's my citizenship. My father is Saudi. And they're like, no, technically you don't count for. And that was perfectly okay. Now, keep in mind, the girl who said that had a lot of power due to her status. And so the teacher completely accommodated that request. And she's like, you're right. We should create another category for another type of percentage. So that's like an anecdotal situation of where even in the most benign spaces, which is school, there was this kind of calling out and recognition of like, okay, yeah, no, you're not really one of us. When I went to college there, I only lasted a semester because I could not. Same thing, I'd have questions, from girls. Are you Saudi? Yes. Are you really though? You don't look Saudi. Your body's not Saudi. The way you conduct yourself is not Saudi. I'm like, I am. Where's your father from? From Hail. Oh, really? Where's your mother from? Italian. Oh, you should have said so. That's why you don't look Saudi. You don't even look Arab. So it was a constant thing, but it wasn't said in a way that was, oh, this is so interesting. It was like, yeah, I mean, great, but yeah, you're not technically one of us. So perpetually, this was all day long.
Hmm. Hmm. And did you have to follow, like, was your father's family as traditional and conservative as your typical Saudi Arabian family? Like, did your mom just kind of adhere to all of the Saudi rules, or were you kind of like hanging out on Aramco, compound and with the American kids? And were you kind of straddling both East and West when you were growing up?
So, having grown up in Riyadh, we were definitely in the middle of the country, not in Aramco, where it was a little more open on those compounds in the eastern province or in the western province, Jeddah, which is also a little more progressive. We were in the heart of the country where it's extremely traditional. The hold of the Wahhabis is really, really strong in that region. So, aside from hanging out with our Hafi friends who were just like us growing up, that was our safe bubble. When we were at home with those friends, it was all good. It was just us. We were ourselves. And the moment we went into society, then we'd have to sort of adhere to those standards. My father's family is extremely traditional. They come from the north, so they're not from the central region, but they are very traditional. My father grew up in a mud house, in an adobe mud house. My most of the females in my father's generation and the generation before me were not educated. Um, my father's the first one who went abroad and studied. Out of his generation, he's the only one that did. So they very, very traditional, covering all of that. Um, a little bit of a blend of religion and culture and tradition, but definitely your typical traditional Saudi. When we would visit our uncles' houses, the women and men were segregated. The men ate first, the women ate after them. Just kind of your traditional, very, I want to say modern Bedouin lifestyle. So that was kind of that blend of being able to recognize that there's both of these worlds happening. Now, when we left the house, we had to fully and completely adhere. And my father, in our home, my parents were not religious or, traditional or, and see that was the really intense kind of conflict that happened in our heads is like we knew who we were, but then the minute we left the house, we had to be a completely different person, conforming to those expectations. And from the moment I hit puberty, that's when everything changed. So we weren't mixing anymore with young boys and playing with our friends. It was just the girls, just the boys, just the men, just the women. And in society, I had to completely conform to how everybody did. Like you had to cover basically from my tween years or right after puberty. And girls get their periods very early in that part of the world. So there was this immediate distinction of how to navigate this absolute. It's not even code switching. It's a bizarre, almost bipolar thing. You're just going back and forth. You're switching back and forth constantly.
Hmm. Yeah. So how did your mom go from being a free Italian woman to this world? Because I imagine for her it probably would be much more of a culture shock. For you, if you're born into it, you're not going to know it's not normal, or you're not going to be surprised by the fact that there's religious police whipping women's ankles because that's all you've ever known. But for your mom coming from Europe where people are hitting the beaches topless, suddenly she's going to have to cover herself head to toe in niqab. Like, what was the why? Why would she do that? What was her, did she ever talk to you about why she made this decision?
Oh, this was always, I mean, I'm 51 now and I've asked her this question, almost every year of my life. And I have to say, this is always the question that a lot of people are curious around, like how does this make sense? And I will say, in her defense, this was a choice she made. She was not brainwashed into anything. She was not manipulated into anything. This was really a choice she made. My mom was always very curious about the world, about other cultures, about other ways of thinking. She's got a very philosophical brain. She never really conformed to Catholicism or really any particular religion in the sense that she was curious about everything and wanted to learn about everything. I think, when you fall in love, and this is, I think it's hard for people to understand, but when you fall in love, you kind of have this like dream idea. And of course, she met my father who was studying in Italy, in Florence. My father's was a very intelligent, intellectual, kind, sweet man. So the love was the one thing, right, that happened between them, which was like, oh, it's worth it for this love, right? But then there was also the piece that my mom, and I really have to respect that. I've learned to respect that as I've grown older with my very strong convictions. For her, the conformity of that lifestyle was not an issue, was not a burden. She didn't see it as anything negative. She didn't necessarily conform to Islamic fundamentalist practices because she still lived her life. And being Western, she had a little more freedom to get away with certain behaviors or choices or traveling and coming and going where, people did not expect it of her like they do of young Arab girls. For her, it was just like, oh, with this lovely Western woman who's really conformed and she's respected our culture. And so there's a little more leeway for her not to 100% adhere to every single thing, even though she really did for the most part. She found the culture charming. She found aspects of it very secure, endearing. It's very, very interesting. And I've asked her, like I said, a million times, how could you leave Florence for, Saudi Arabia? And for her, I think she's so cerebral that for her, as long as her intellect was consistently being stimulated by the things that she was interested in, her travels, the people she talked to, the people she met. And she met wonderful people in Saudi Arabia. There's a huge expat community that because they had to be underground, there was really interesting things that they would talk about and unveil. But for us, it's so different for me to be able to wrap my mind around it, especially growing up, because I felt like it was a sense of um, almost like a betrayal. Like, how can I not have that choice? But my parents having no role models prior to them or no idea that this would be such a profound, impactful, heavy process for us, I think I will boil it down to honestly sheer naivete. And still today, I mean, for her, this is, she has no negative impacts or consequences from her choices. We obviously, me especially, I speak for myself, obviously. For me, it was a lot of wrapping my mind around and undoing and releasing and letting go and acceptance, that true, respectful acceptance that everybody chooses their path. And yeah, I just I have to release that.
So did she convert to Islam?
She did. So she did convert to Islam, obviously on paper. And for the most part, I remember growing up, she identified as a Muslim, but I don't remember my parents doing any particular hardcore rituals at home. I mean, we fasted during Ramadan because that's such a cultural thing, but I don't remember like prayer at home like all the time, or there was nothing religious about it. We weren't like sitting down reading and studying the Quran, or it was a cultural title or label, if you will. And I don't know that my
Mm.
mom considers herself a Muslim now. I don't think so. I think on paper that was a convenient thing to do, and maybe for a while that was a conviction thing as well. But I was very young when that actually occurred.
So in public schools in Saudi Arabia, you have to take like 5 or 6 Islamic courses. That wasn't the case for
9.
you in this. Okay. So you were very versed in Islam, but you
Oh
just
yeah.
weren't practicing it.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't escape it. And for us, it was 9 subjects. And that's why when I the times when I speak, people are like, well, you don't even know Islam. You never read it. You didn't study it. I'm like, okay, hold my beer, as they say. Like, are you kidding me? Like, absolutely, there was no escaping it. Everywhere you went, that was constantly being fed to you. So no, I am very, very familiar with Islam and Islamic teachings. And I say I'm not a scholar because that's not what I, deep dive into on a scholarly level, but I'm very familiar with it. Absolutely. So
So you
that
learned it
was,
kind of on an intellectual level, but you didn't actually ever really practice it. Like you weren't praying 5 times a day. Like when you wore hijab, it was because you live in Saudi and the religious police are going to get you, not because you believed in it or because you felt the
right.
conviction. Okay.
Oh, absolutely. For me, it was never a conviction. And the praying 5 times a day was only if I was in an environment where it was expected for us to pray. So it was a hypocrisy type of prayer. I never actually at home thought, oh, it's prayer time, I should pray. No, it was if I was in an
Mm-hmm.
environment, everyone's like, all right, let's get up and pray. And with the hijab,
Mm-hmm.
I do want to point out. So the hijab, and I know you know this, Yasmin, but just for larger context, the hijab specifically is, the coverage of the hair only, right? It's just you, so your face is open, and the hijab is a Islamic practice. It's a devotionary act that women choose to embrace and to live as a muhajjaba, which is a woman that wears a hijab. I know here they say hijabi, but it's really muhajjaba is the word, right? And so women wear the hijab, and it's a religious conviction. They wear it whether they're outside or they're inside or around people who are not their male guardians or women. Um, for me, I was never muhajjaba, or I never wore a hijab in a traditional devotional sense because I never chose to do it. I was expected to cover from head to toe when I was outside of the home. So it wasn't even a hijab. Now, when I was in public, I would wear the hijab, so to speak, and then I would put the veil on my face. The minute I would notice there was no religious police or I was in a somewhat safe environment at a store or whatever, then I'd pull the cover down from my face. So even my everything was covered, not my I didn't wear a niqab or a burqa or any of those. I wore, the thing around my head and then just threw the cover. And so when I'd uncover, the minute the religious police would come, if I was in the mood to argue with them, which I never was because it wasn't worth it, I would just throw the veil on my face and cover. So and traveling, for the most part, I didn't cover, um, except for the few times that I talk about in the book with my first husband, where there were some expectations because we were traveling in Arab countries. But it's confusing because there is both the imposition of it and then there's the religious devotional piece of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. And that sounds very typical. That's
Mhm.
why when you're flying out of Saudi Arabia, there's like, as soon as the plane hits a certain elevation, you see like this sea of black
Yep.
being
Yep.
thrown off of women's faces and heads and bodies. Yeah,
Exactly.
so
The
it's
shedding.
because they're forced to wear it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is of course similar to women in Iran and women in Afghanistan. I mean, I don't think they have the power to rip it off like that. The way Saudi women are kind of like it's because of the power dynamics, it makes things different for Saudi people. They're
Right.
usually traveling where they have, they're at a different socioeconomic level, so they have a bit more
Exactly.
power.
Exactly. And
Um,
oftentimes it wasn't on Saudi Airlines. It would be like on Swiss Air or Lufthansa or like some
mhm.
other airline where it was like, this really feels like you can do it now. And the minute you're in the air, like you said, yeah, such a common
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, even here in the West, I used to teach in high schools here, and you would see that too. Girls would come in with hijab, rip it off, shove it in their backpack, and then before they go home, put it back on again. And I would always look at them and be like, I'm so proud of this new
Yeah.
generation because I never had the ovaries to do that. Like I was
Mm,
way too scared. I just
yeah.
like, of course, my brother and my sister were um even when they weren't in the same school as me, because I'm the youngest one, like I just was too scared. Like in this neighborhood, somebody's gonna see me, like somebody's gonna tell on me. But the girls that did do that, I was always very proud of them.
Yeah.
So
It's
yeah,
kind
that's
of,
what
it's
happens. You
wild.
force people into it. Yeah.
Yep.
And then I mean you're
It's a
being
total
forced into it
gaslighting.
at so many different levels too, because you've
Yep.
got religious police there too. Not anymore, but when you were growing up, there were religious police there that were controlling girls. And so you're not it's so crazy because these theocracies, like you can't force people to become religious. You can't force people to believe in this faith. You know what I mean? Like you can have laws and most people in Iran are atheists for goodness sake, or Zoroastrian. Like they don't believe in Islam. Just
Right.
because you're putting people in prison for it or forcing them, under threat of death even, to like not drink alcohol, not be gay, all of the rules of Islam. Doesn't matter. People are still going to do what they want to do and, hopefully not have to suffer the consequences. But yeah, you can't force people to follow a religion. It's just
No.
so barbaric.
It is because the consequence, right, is death, or there's so many
Yeah.
very like aggressive, violent punishments to people who choose not to. And supposedly it's getting a
They'll
little better
abide by
now.
the rules, but they
Right.
don't believe it.
Exactly. Exactly. And the tragedy in all of this is that as small changes happen, we want to pretend like this didn't happen or it's not still happening in certain areas. And that's why, having these conversations, it's so important because it doesn't mean that history didn't happen. We can't just pretend that it didn't happen and just go gloss over it and, well, now you're here or now you're living in this freedom or liberty. It's like, but first of all, it doesn't mean that because the larger majority of women who chose to do that were able to confidently and successfully succeed and move past all of this. But there are still a lot of, you know, an unbelievable amount of women that still live under these
Yeah.
impositions. Even in the countries where these laws are changing a little bit, there's still that mentality that does not go away. And so like, well, I mean, even for you, Yasmin, I mean, you grew up here and you were in a community that felt this way, here as in the
Mhm.
West, in a community that felt this way. And even within your own community, you couldn't look past it and say, well, I mean, I'm still safe if I were to get out. I'm not going to be chased by the law. And
Mhm.
it's extremely dangerous.
Yeah, it was irrelevant. I mean, we all have different controls around us. Like, what you're describing here are people who were kind of irreligious in their homes, but controlled by the government. Whereas for me, it was the exact opposite of that. My home was that's where the religious police lived. Like
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
was the scare. They were in, my house. They hung out in my kitchen.
Hmm.
But there obviously the I wasn't afraid of law enforcement in the country.
Right.
So
Right.
it's just a different level or a different connection or a different relationship with your tyrant.
Right. Yeah.
So tell me about escaping to America, as you mentioned, as I mentioned in the bio there, taking off your hijab and, leaving Islam. How did your family respond to all that? And what are your connections to your family today? And, what are your feelings about that whole situation of going from Saudi to America? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I was previously so as a very young girl, obviously having all these ideas and thoughts, it was really hard because part of me felt like I'm doomed to this life. I have to pretty much adhere to this, despite how, progressive or open-minded my parents were. There was the expectation. It was somewhat unspoken. It was like, yeah, you're gonna do these things, you're gonna grow up, you're gonna get married to a Saudi man, you're gonna have a family, all this kind of conformed blueprint of what the expectation is, because that's what the expectation is culturally. And so I sort of, and I go into detail in the book, but I sort of met this other Saudi young man who was born and raised in the US. And so he had a little bit more of a modern outlook on life and also wanted sort of a progressive wife. And so we got married super young, 19 years old. My parents weren't necessarily thrilled about it because they were not of the idea to get married super, super young or even marrying your cousin, which we didn't do, but a lot of other people were. But we got married and in the years of our marriage, it was fine. We traveled a lot. We had good times and bad times. But, in my heart, I knew that this couldn't be a sustainable marriage forever. He became more and more conformed to Saudi Arabia the longer we stayed, and the more his career kind of took off and more friends he made. And, you're maturing now as a man in this culture that's built for you with all of its
Yeah.
commodities and all of its conveniences. And for me, I was becoming more and more disassociated and disheartened and disengaged and really starting to feel a sense of desperation. Once that marriage ended, I knew at that point I was damaged goods because as a girl that was married a virgin who then is divorced, your only hope in the future, if you are to remarry, is to be a second wife. No man wants his first to be, a divorcee or a non-virgin. So I thought, okay, there's no way that that's the life that I want for myself. So I really had to find a way to escape because at that point, I was 25 years old and my life just felt like it had taken an absolute halt. I didn't want to go back and live with my parents because then I would be going from a husband's guardianship to now my father or potentially my brother. And so while I was plotting my escape, I had a friend who is actually Canadian and we grew up together. She was back in Canada at the time, and I thought, okay, I'm kind of plotting this escape. And in the meantime, while this was all happening, I met and fell in love with an American man that was there. And so while we didn't plan our escape together, we aligned it because he was ready to leave everything so we can be together, and I was ready to just like get away from there. And so when I first left, I didn't just leave because I knew prior to my escape, no other woman successfully just managed to escape. I mean, it's really hard. If you get caught, a lot of the consequences were very dramatic. And so I've never heard of anyone prior to my plotting. And so I had to really be intelligent about it. You have to have that guardian permission from your guardian, a letter of an official letter with a, notarized that your guardian says you are allowed to travel. You had to take that to the airport with your passport and your visa and whatever that is, that, whatever paperwork you need. And so I got my father to write that letter for me. I told him I was going to travel to Italy to visit, our family, and then also maybe go to the US with my cousin, my Italian cousin, who, is like a big brother, because I needed that visa to the United States or I couldn't leave, right? I could leave Saudi Arabia and go to Europe, but I couldn't make it all the way to the US. So, and I tell the story and I don't say this with a lot of joy or a lot of pride or, ha, look at me. It was hard. It was hard to lie and to manipulate my father because my father's, a sweet, kind man. And I know people judge my parents because they think that my parents should have known better. They should have given me all these permissions. But, in context, and when we look at history, certain behaviors happen because the context is so powerful over our own agency at times. So I forgive how that transpired, but I don't hold animosity against my parents, especially because I was able to then find my way out. But I managed to, plan this escape, get the permission that I needed, and finally make it out. Once I arrived in the United States, I did go to Italy. I visited my family. And then when I made it to the United States, I waited. I told my dad I was going to be here for a couple of weeks. And I called my dad and I said, hey, I have an opportunity to go to school. I'm getting full scholarship to attend a college. And my father's big on education. So he's like, okay. And I said, I'm divorced now. I'm going through all this like stress and changes. I'd love to just stay here and go to school for a while, which was true. I was, I had applied and I was going to college, but I was also planning to stay permanently. But I gave it to him in doses. And initially he's like, okay, that's fine, that's great. But then as the months went by and I said, hey, like I actually met someone here. I want to stay. I want to, marry this guy or whatever. That's when my father was completely heartbroken. And, my family did not take it very well again, because it's hard to be the first in these situations because you're bringing shame to the family or you're going against the grain and it causes a lot of cleaning up for them. I'm gone. So the idea is that she's selfish. She got what she wanted. She's not here to clean up the mess, but they had to deal with a lot of, the talk of town and the gossip and all of that. And I feel for that, but at the same time, you have to pick between two evils, right? So it took for about, 2, 3 years before my dad was able to, come back around and re-embrace our relationship once my first child was born, my firstborn, because I had also a bonus child from the marriage who was in my life. But once my firstborn came in to my life, that's when my dad sort of softened and my relationship with my family reconciled at that point. My relationship with my mom was always fine because she knew what I was planning on doing and gave me her blessings, but kind of also washed her hands from my choices. My sister and I are very, very close, and it was hard at first because being so close, as close as we are, it was hard for me to just kind of go away and not tell her. So there was some hurt there. And my brother finally did come around, and now I'm very close to my siblings. Um, and yeah, so there's challenges with them fully accepting, even after 25 years, there's challenges. Obviously, me writing the book and becoming a lot more outspoken in the last 5, 6 years has been hard for some members of the family. It's not an easy thing, and I don't know that most people understand that you have a calling to do the work that you do, not because you are, sensationalizing thing or looking for attention or just wanting to blow the whistle. This is work that is very profound because you know that there's injustices that are happening and you want to speak to them in a way that is hopefully engaged enough without always, heated anger. So yeah, just kind of my answer is sort of wrapping up the whole trajectory of it all. It hasn't always been easy. Even my life in the United States hasn't always been easy, but it has been 100% worth it without a doubt because the outcome is the resilience that comes with this kind of challenge and challenges of life is you definitely create a platform for yourself and for others where we are finally talking about these things. I mean, 25 years growing up in that, it just felt like it was a forgotten part of the world that no one cared, no one knew about what women were going through, no one really engaged in that conversation. And then we might also get into this, Yasmin, but the West's perception of that part of the world and its modern perception is really it actually angers me because there's such a
Well,
misperception and a romanticizing.
that's what I wanted to ask you about now is Saudi Arabia now under MBS is very different than it was when, 25 years ago when you were living there. So a lot of the girls that I know that escape now are able to do it with an app. When their dad is asleep, just go into his
Yep.
phone and click accept. So, that's just one of the many differences. Of course, now women are not, there's no such thing as a religious police anymore. Women are not forced to wear hijab anymore, or abaya even. Women can live alone, women can drive, like there's all sorts of really positive changes. Of course, the guardianship laws are still there. They're just not quite as imposed
Mhm.
as they used to be, but unfortunately, they still exist for conservative families that want to use them. It's there for their
Yep.
bludgeoning of their daughters. So, how are you feeling about Saudi Arabia today? Are you feeling hopeful? Are you feeling suspicious? What are your thoughts on the current state of the country?
Um, so it's hard for me to give a full assessment because I'm not there and I haven't been there in 26 years. So since I've been gone, I have not gone back. What I see is what all of us see, which is through the lens of what social media tells us, what the news tells us, and also obviously having some minimal relationship with some friends or old friends that maybe go back or maybe still live there. So I will say that what I will share how I feel about it is very, very anecdotal and very
Just your personal opinion.
superficial.
Yeah.
Sure. And it's very superficial. Again, of course, there's a part of me that really celebrates the changes. It's wonderful. It's great. I'm happy for the modern generation and for the young people who have a very uh, renewed approach and sense of belonging in the world because it's really isolating when you're seeing the world live a certain way and you're isolated from that. So that piece is really wonderful. I I don't know how I feel about the sustainability of it. I do think it's going to continue to progress in that direction. What I worry about is that we are not fully addressing what has happened. So it always makes me feel like how again, sustainable is it for women, especially if we are glossing over aspects of what has happened? It's such a drastic shift that without even addressing it or talking about it, I have concerns. And I'm not specifically talking about the government or about MBS specifically. I'm talking about the culture, the society as a whole, the mentality of that entire region. This is not a conversation they're having, and I don't know why they're not having it, whether it's not allowed or whether it's they're fearful or whether it's because it's just not on their radar. They're just so happy with everything that's changing that they don't feel the need to sort of, do a, post-mortem analysis of what had happened and where do we move forward from here, making sure that these are sustainable changes. So that's what I worry about because from the intellectual standpoint, you can't see a swift change. It's like when a body has a disease. It's one thing to say, okay, we address the current infection or the overall issue and the problem. But if that infection keeps coming back, there's an underlying situation that has not been addressed, like autoimmune or whatever. That's what I worry about societies like these when I see these changes in cultures, that it's like it's a superficial, drastic change and it's for the better as it appears to be. It remains to be seen. That's why I'm sort of in limbo and hopeful, but in limbo.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. There's a documentary called Islam and the Future of Tolerance with Sam Harrison, Majid Nawaz, and Sam makes the point that I can't remember what exactly this thing is called, but when you drop the marble into those things, like, or if you drop a penny, if you're dropping it for charity,
Then
and it
it
goes
just
around and
goes.
around and around and
Yeah.
around and around. And in the end, it's always going to go down that same one little hole.
Yeah.
And really, that's, I think what you're saying here is, if we're not going to start, yeah, it's great that you're taking all the anti-Semitic hadith out of the books, out of the curriculum in schools. And it's great that you're, not allowing any sort of jihadist talk in the mosques. But it's like, are you actually, are you putting band-aids on and like kind of dealing with the symptoms of the issue, or are you addressing the root cause of these issues? And that's a big question, because I don't expect I don't expect Saudi Arabia to be addressing the root cause of these issues. They're still, it's an absolute monarchy, and they are based, their whole ethos, like their whole reason for raison d'etre is the Kaaba, Mecca, Medina, Allah's house, people coming there for Hajj every year, that's, I don't expect them to take it any further, because it's going to cost them too much, not just literally cost them financially,
Right.
but also just like that's what their entire country is based upon, is Islam.
Right. It's the identity.
So
It's their full identity.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, just to provide kind of context to that, a Saudi citizen, when from the conception of Saudi Arabia, which was the late 1930s, to recently, and I don't know actually now, I've tried to find out and I haven't gotten confirmation, but a Saudi citizen is born automatically a Muslim. You don't have a
yeah.
choice. It's,
Mhm,
and I don't know if Iran does this too, but I think it's the only country in the world that has declared your religion as part of your nationality. So there is a
mhm,
really hard situation to separate those two. And then there's also the political piece, right? There's the government piece and there's the religion and then there's the culture. So it's
mhm.
this triad
It's all
of
intertwined.
confusion. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, I am going to now open it up to questions and comments from people who have come here to chat with you. So let's start with
Great.
you, Natalie. Go ahead.
Thanks, Yasmin. Jasmine, thank you so much for the for your story and sharing it so transparently. I had a question. My original question was about how did you feel belonging wise with your wider family, but I really want to ask, so what you're describing, the way that your mom fit in the culture, the religion, the social fabric, I've never heard such seamless fitting in with the Wahhabi culture, because back then it was very much Wahhabi. So can you please tell more about that? And I find it also hard to believe there were no, okay, so maybe she was completely accepting of that, but with you, a person who did find her way out, there were no daily frictions. I cannot, it's really hard for me to imagine. Also, being myself, coming from more conservative family, trying to find my way out, it was daily frictions. And I was a very like, I didn't try to look for fights, but they were coming up because what you want is very different from what your parents want. So if you can address those two issues, your belonging feeling in the family, and whether there were any frictions on a daily basis, that would be very interesting.
Okay. Absolutely, there was friction. If I made it sound like there wasn't, uh, I didn't unpack the entire Of course, there was friction. There was this constant sense of desperation and frustration and angst on my part. My mom was very good at navigating it. So she validated my feelings and allowed me to express my frustration, my anger, my apathy, all of those feelings. The reason why there was a balance there was because even though when we left the house, there was that imposition to, conform and behave, at home, we were able to talk about everything. We were able to talk about religion. We were able to talk about God. We were able to talk about philosophy. I mean, my mom is a very, very intellectual person. And so we could sit down and she was really into New Age at the time, it was like the wave of the New Age movement in the 1980s. So we talked about God and philosophy and spirituality, and we were exposed to all kinds of spiritual teachings just as a kind of an educational tool. Like we knew everything about Eastern religions, Western religions, non-religious spiritual teachings. So I I had that balance to where even my frustration could be tamed by allowing and creating room for having these conversations. And my mom would always say to me, in this room, when we talk, everything is open and we can talk about things. It just can't leave. And my dad used to tell me when I'd come home from school and I'd say, they said this and this at school and the religion, and that this will happen when we die or whatever. My dad would say, when you're in the class and you're in religious class, let it go in one ear and out the other. You just focus on your math, your science, and those things. So, I, I know it's hard to kind of grasp that, but it really despite everything, my parents did a good enough job to where we came out okay. Like we came out okay in the sense that yes, of course we have our traumas and all that, but my resentment is more towards the cultural impositions and the ideologies and the people and the way I was treated outside of the home. So, but there was friction. I mean, of course, I was a very, very intense teenager and and there were moments where when my mom did not necessarily appreciate, some of my pushback or maybe even more so as an adult. I think the friction is far more intense and delicate now as an adult than it was when I was a teenager.
Thank you. And with regard to you feeling belonging to your wider family, your cousins, grandparents, was that there, or do you feel like you have an accent? Do you have an accent in Arabic?
No, so I learned Arabic well enough where I don't have an accent. When we were kids, we did, and my young cousins used to speak to us in broken Arabic because our Arabic wasn't perfect to start with. My mom made sure we learned Italian first because that was the language that would be the hardest to learn, having less exposure to it in our everyday life. So we speak Italian like natives, and then English, and then Arabic once we went to school. So I speak fluently in all three languages. I don't have any relationship with my father's side of the family. Growing up a little bit, but once we hit puberty, the only people I saw on occasion were my uncles, but I don't have any relationship with any of my cousins, just because we never felt fully embraced. They may superficially say that they did, but we were always others. With my mom's side of the family, I'm very close and still am, and I see them every year, and there's a completely different connection there. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, great questions, Natalie. Thank you for that. Graham, you're next.
Jasmine, great talk.
Thank you.
This is a question about your education in sociology. As a sociologist, I'm fascinated by what you've been through, and so I'm curious how your sociology studies affected your worldview, and if you did a thesis in your sociology studies, did you focus on something that had to do with your own background, your own life experiences?
I love that sociology connection. That's amazing. Thank you, Graham. So sociology felt like a kind of a shoo-in because for me, being curious about the cultures of the world and just like how people live their lives, it just was like an easy path. And I love writing as well. So those two went hand in hand. I studied sociology in my undergrad, so there wasn't any major project or theses for it. But most of my focus was specifically, obviously, just your general sociology and the impact of societal behavior, but then also looking at cultures and how the sort of the difference between how we look at sociology from a Western lens and how we observe other cultures again through that Western lens. And where I live in Washington State, we are also very kind of aware of understanding Indigenous and Native American approaches to things. So even though I can't say that I've done a deep dive there because it's a little intimidating, there is a huge similarity between the indigenous cultures and the indigenous cultures of the Arab world, in some cultural practices, but just in kind of the general, yeah, it's kind of fascinating to see that. But to go more specifically into your question, I what I did do is in my graduate studies where I was focusing more on public policy and things like that, I did an entire deep dive into cults and religions, and that's where I really wanted to kind of see the difference between how cults are born and how religions form and where the association between the two. That's kind of where I took my sociological studies into, is really trying to understand and dissect the impact of cults as they're formed, old cults, new cults, and then how religions are basically this, marinated, seasoned cult that then takes on a life of its own, and how we can really study sociology through religions based on where these religions or these cults are born. So this is a conversation we could have for hours and hours, but to answer your question, this is kind of where I took the sociology with my own upbringing and curiosity.
Thank you, Graham. Before we go to you, Mohammed, I'm just going to ask a question that somebody in the group here doesn't want to ask for themselves. So I'm just going to read it for you, Jasmine.
Sure.
What are Jasmine's thoughts on the trends of Islamization in Europe? Given she escaped from Saudi and all the Islamic dogma and restrictions, how does she feel about these current trends on the rise in Western society?
Okay, I'm going to jump outside of the delicate. Okay. I believe everybody should have the right to practice the lifestyle that they want and choose however they want to live, whether it's religion or any other kind of social decision. I do have concerns about the widespread of Islam in the form that it is spreading around the world, specifically in the West and in Europe. And I say this not from a non-tolerant perspective, because I know I will be accused of being Islamophobic, which is a whole other conversation. Where my concerns are is that when these fundamental ways of practicing Islam are not in alignment with Western standards, I just don't see why they have to sort of infringe upon each other, specifically in the area where they are, going towards a lifestyle that is already established, and that's the Western value lifestyle. So that's the one piece, which again, it's up to those cultures and countries to make that decision for themselves. Where my actual deep concerns are is in the fact that because Islam is the only religion we cannot question, criticize, dissect, talk about, it creates a very intense, imposed upon cancel culture that is actually dangerous. So I worry about that ideology penetrating the lifestyles of aspects of the West where we can question anything, where we can debate anything, where we can accuse things or go against the grain. That's what scares me, because as a kind of a freedom of speech absolutist and as a someone that really believes there should be nothing that we cannot discuss or talk about, that's the part that scares me, is in these very fundamental ideologies, there's a very, very, very powerful imposition, on society. But I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think it did. So we have someone who wants to ask you if you think some of the statistics about Saudi Arabia are fair. I don't, no more context. That's it. Does Jasmine think some of the statistics about Saudi Arabia are fair?
A little hard to answer
I
the
don't know.
question having no context.
Yeah.
Can I just say, that's my question. And I was
Okay.
specifically going to Freedom House. So Freedom House has scored Saudi Arabia as 9 out of 100. For perspective, Jordan gets, I think, 34 out of 100, and Italy gets 89 out of 100.
For
So I
what?
can hear
What
you
is
okay.
this? What are we
It's
measuring
cutting-
here?
Yeah.
Yeah, the relative freedom.
Oh,
So
the
it's a
amount of freedom.
combination
Okay.
of personal freedom and political freedom.
Okay,
And
so Saudi Arabia's score, Jasmine, for freedom is 9 out of 100 as compared to Italy, which is 89 out of 100. So
Yeah.
he's asking, is that sounds fair to you? That sounds about right.
Very much so, yeah. Or at least from my experience. I don't know now. To ask about that statistic today for someone that's living there, I think would be a little more fair for them to answer that. But for me, from my experience and current observation, I would say that sounds about right.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
That's what I'm expecting, but it's good to hear from someone who actually has family there.
Thank you.
Great. All right, Sarah, you go ahead. Sarah S.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this discussion. So thank you so much for sharing your story. I just wanted to know what you thought about a burqa ban just in the UK. I think one of the MPs of the reform movement asked the Prime Minister if he would consider a burqa ban, and he, of course, totally dismissed it. We know that I think in some Muslim majority countries there are actually burqa bans. like in Tunisia, and I think in some European countries also. I'm just curious if you think that's effective, if you think it's discriminatory, and if it should actually be applied, how, like, what should be the reasoning behind it?
This is a really tricky one. I've thought about this a lot because it comes up in conversation very often. The part of me that believes in absolute kind of liberties for all, live and let live, has a hard time with saying that we want to impose those types of bans. But the other part of me that knows the consequences of this possible oppressive practice, especially when you are infiltrating in societies that have been established under a specific norm, that concerns me. There are countries in the world where they'll allow you, not only allow you, they will force you to live with that particular lifestyle practice. And so I have a really hard time when specific folks or groups or droves of people choose to leave the one area where this is the absolute lifestyle and the way of being, to then go and impose that lifestyle onto another society that has a very different practice. So I'm personally in favor of the bans because I find them dangerous, concerning. There's and by the way, most of the times those women who are wearing the burqa are probably, or hijab or whatever it is, they're probably not doing it by choice. And so as someone that's really committed to fighting for women's rights, I have concerns about that. I hope that kind of starts. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, it does. I mean, I actually grew up very religious, Orthodox Jewish, and I used to pray every morning that skirts would be banned by government because I wanted to wear jeans. Obviously, this is totally, it's not comparable to your experience and to those experiences that you've been through. But I mean, there was a part of me that thought that I don't think that security is a good reasoning behind it, because then all other kinds of things will have to be banned, like sunglasses. I mean, I know this is kind of silly, but like that's what I thought. So I was thinking, if there is a ban, it has to be kind of specific to women's rights. And there is also part of me that's very pro-liberty, like you, that I'm just like, I don't think it's possible to do that, to make that kind of ban. But then there's another part of me that thinks if we could help just at least one girl who really just is being super oppressed in let's say a Western country, and we can just help her and just making that law, even just one person, I think that it would be worth it. But I guess it's for discussion, but we just have to be willing to have that discussion as a Western society.
Exactly. That's exactly it. It's a very conflicting sensation, and that's one that I really struggle with, because part of me, like I said, really wants to honor the liberties for all, and then part of me, it's something we don't know. It's an unknown, and until we see how it impacts society, it'll be really hard to have a conviction around that belief. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
All right. So as somebody who wore niqab and didn't have the ability to just like rip it up or down or on or off, depending on the context or where I was, I had to wear it 24/7, niqab covering my face, gloves on my hands, thick socks on my feet, abaya in between. Basically, I looked like a dementor, and that's how I had to live in the world. I'm really offended when somebody calls that a lifestyle choice. It's not a lifestyle choice. It's dehumanization of women. We have to quit these euphemisms, and we have to express the reality of what these things are. If we're going to keep on pretending that it's a religious choice and some people want to do it and some people don't, then we're not speaking the truth. And then that will leave room for people to come in and be like, no, it's totally my 9-year-old's daughter's choice to wear this, right? We're leaving that door open when that's just not the reality, right? When we're talking about female genital mutilation, when we're talking about, I don't know, tattooing a swastika on your face, there's all sorts of horrible things that people do in this world. And we're not like, well, it's their choice, it's just their lifestyle choice. No, we have to have boundaries. We have to have clear, there's right and there's wrong, there's good and there's bad, there's abuse and there's not abuse, and we have to be clear about that. So we don't have to come up with excuses. We don't have to say, oh, because it's security issues, and then people are gonna be like, well, what about masks? Well, what about sunglasses? Like, we don't need any reasons other than saying, this is dehumanizing to women. This gets women killed currently. We're not even talking about like history. We're not even talking about like Algeria in the 90s or something. We're talking about right now, today, not just by governments, but like by families, by husbands, by fathers, by brothers, right? So this is something that is currently torturing women. It is a misogynist tool of control of women. And if we address it as such, and if we see it as such, and if we admit it as such, then we're going to have a lot easier time having the conversation when we are honest about what we are talking about. And nowhere in the Quran or in the Ahadith does it say that a woman needs to be covering her face, right?
Yeah.
In actuality, yeah. So I was just going to say, the only time you see a woman covering her face is when it's coming from an extremist family, an extremist ideology, an extremist background. And so we absolutely must be protecting ourselves from these religious extremists, because they are not just extreme in and of themselves, in their own homes, in their own mosques. They want to spread Islam. That's the whole point, is they want to spread a global caliphate. And these people are Islamists. They're political Muslims, and there's jihadis amongst them, and it is dangerous for everybody, not just for the woman who's wearing it, but for the society that she's living in as well. So when it comes to that conversation, I agree with you, Jasmine, it should be banned. And I agree with you, Sarah, we definitely do have to have this conversation honestly. And I think if we have an honest conversation, we'll have an easier time getting to the actual honest answers and the honest results of, how we can solve this problem.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and say, I thank you for pointing out, because I was getting ready to talk about the fact that there is nowhere in the religion that says this is an actual religious practice. So you brought that up. You brought that point beautifully. I literally was just having this conversation with someone very, very recently about the fact that the spread of Islam in Western society, to me, is a very dangerous and problematic thing, because it is doing all the things you just said. Above, on top of all that, and above all, what it is doing is that it is giving permission for the West to take a back seat on its responsibility towards social justice and human rights, with the excuses of practices and norms and religions and all that. You are absolutely right. We have got to stop this. And I always say, let that part of the world figure out its own stuff. If they want to stay in that conservative lifestyle, that is fine. I couldn't care less. I don't have a problem with it. If everyone's in agreement and wants to live that way, that's fine. But the minute you violate human rights, it is the responsibility of the West to interfere. And that's why I speak on the human rights piece, not to interfere and tell people how they should practice their religion. I couldn't care less.
We went through so much trouble to get women to where we are today. Like, we only just got the vote like a freaking 100 years ago. Like, everything's new. Like, in the 70s, women finally got the right to get a credit card without their male, their husband co-signing with them, or whatever the case may be. Like, there's so many ridiculous things. We have videos of women trying to run marathons being attacked by men in the 60s. Like, these are very fragile new freedoms that we have. You know what I mean? And we are not in the very comfortable, strong position right now where we can be like, that's okay. You can come in here with your anti-women views and we can, we'll accept that. No, absolutely not. We will not accept that. Like, we're not accepting it. We are progressing our own societies. We're not going to invite barbaric practices from other societies to drag us back. It's absolutely ridiculous. So when we look at this, I think it needs to be looked at honestly from a human rights lens, of course, but also women's rights lens, which is human rights. I don't even know if it's not even women's rights. It's like women's, I don't even know, life. Like, women,
we've
like
dehumanized
freedom,
women.
literally.
We've dehumanized women, which is why when we think of human rights, we don't think of it as, we think of women's rights as its own thing. Women's rights are human rights, period. There's
That's
no
true, but this is a
question about that.
specific woman issue.
Absolutely.
And there are many sex, issues that are specifically gender-based that have to do with women, and this is one of them. And I think that's why so many people can be so comfortable, because unfortunately we know this to be true, right? Misogyny is tradition, right? If it was men that were being forced in niqab, we wouldn't be having these conversations. It would be like, no, absolutely not. Let these men breathe, right? But when it's women, it's like,
100%.
but is it her choice though? Maybe
No,
it's her religion.
absolutely.
Maybe it's her tradition, right? So it gets wishy-washy.
And she's protected. We're taking care of her. This is this. We're honoring her. We're protecting her. There's so much artificial conflating of these practices that it makes it sound like this is just coming divinely from God or from nature. Look at nature. This is how it's done. It's I am with you 100% on that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great. And somebody left a really sweet comment, so I'm just going to read it out for everybody to hear because I want everyone to who hasn't read my book to get this from my book. They said, just for Yasmin to know that ever since I started following her, every time I see a woman completely covered, I think there might be another Yasmin under there, and I pray that she finds a way out.
Yeah.
So I don't want you to look at a woman in niqab and be like, oh my God, this is some evil, treacherous person who's coming to take over my society. And she's probably a jihadi and hiding an AK-47 under there. Although that might be true, right? Because they have hidden, bombs under there, and it has happened.
And they're not always women.
And they're not always women. That's true as well. And sometimes they're criminals and, kidnappers and whatever. And this is their way of covering themselves up. You're absolutely correct. But the reality, it's also true simultaneously with that, as we mentioned a few times in this conversation, these are people that are forced into this dehumanizing, burial cloth as they're still breathing. So we have to be cognizant of that. And I love that this person said that. And that's an important thing to remember here is these women are, even if sometimes a person can be a victim and an oppressor at the same time. That's also
100%.
another thing that can be true, although it sounds like a paradox. A lot of these women, if not all of these women, are victims of the viciously violent patriarchal societies that they live in. All right, Mohammed, finally, we got your hand up and we've got your audio unmuted. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yasmin and Sarah, for continuing to bring us these absolutely wonderful conversations. Thank you, Jasmin, for sharing your life experiences. It's quite enlightening. And just for your information, I'm from Algeria, and we are also born Muslims, whether we like it or not. It is the religion of the state. In fact, everybody has to be a Muslim. And if you're not, well, you have to live with the consequences.
Wow.
I have two unrelated questions, unrelated between them. One of them is, while you were in Italy, were you guarded in such a way that you could not get away? Because I would have thought that you would just walk into any embassy, Western country, and they would give you a refugee status right away.
So I wasn't necessarily, guarded is not probably the right word. We were with the family, so it was always, we were together. I don't know that I necessarily felt guarded, but I don't think that thought ever crossed my mind because my plan at first of all, I was very young. I was still, a teenager when I was at home with my parents or a child. That thought never crossed my mind because that's not how I would have probably wanted to do it. I was not in any immediate physical harm or distress in my home with my parents. So yeah, that thought never crossed my mind because I think when you reach that point, it's because you are literally living under very life-threatening situations. I think that's what leads you to that point of having to really go and escape and be a refugee and seek help from an embassy or from someone else. For me, that wasn't my experience at all. Mine was a more intellectual frustration. But then once I became an adult, that's when I was like, okay, I have control here. I can do this. I didn't need to go necessarily as a refugee or as a seeking asylum or anything like that. I was able to sort of orchestrate that. But yeah, I'm sure that that's not everybody's experience. I'm sure for some it feels that detrimental.
In fact, you were not the same. You were not at the same level as a human being, being in Saudi, you were not, you did not have the same rights as man. So as a woman, you could have made a point. And it's exactly the same thing in Algeria. There is the family code, which relegates women to a status basically of a second citizen. And as such, I would have thought that based solely on that, you could get a refugee status just about anywhere.
I probably could have, but it wasn't anything on my radar. As a
Okay.
young girl, especially during a time, we're talking the 80s, when there was no internet, you couldn't really get all this information like thankfully young women can now.
Yeah.
At the time, it was more sort of a circumstantial evolution of where I was in my process.
Okay.
Yeah.
My other question was, I'm not sure if I heard that right, but you got my curiosity going here by talking about a third culture child syndrome. I'd really like to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So the culture child syndrome is for children who are born either in multicultural homes and grew up in multicultures that are either one or none of the cultures where they grew up, or kids who grew up in a certain home with a certain culture in another part of the world. So it's basically that cultural disbursement. A lot of American kids that are maybe army brats who grew up all over the world feel that syndrome as well, because they may be exposed to different cultures, very different from their own, and grow up in these different cultural spaces. So it's that sensation that you are part of a third culture, which is so far removed from your own, because you don't have a really strong connection to your own primary culture or primary cultures. The kids who are born from multiple cultures and grow up in either one or none of those cultures have it, I think, double, because you also have the identity confusion piece. So you're also struggling with your own identity, as opposed to kids who maybe are in a home from a culture, let's say American, and grow up in Japan because their dad was stationed there or their mom was stationed there, and they grow up in another culture. They still have their own identity, but they also are exposed to this other ideology and mentality and way of life. So when they come back to the US, they feel a disconnection from all other Americans because now they have a different perspective. That's one of the many ways in which third culture children, see themselves, or third, yeah. Does that give you a broad?
Yeah, it's just that I'd never heard of somebody talking about it as being a syndrome per se, because children of immigrants for the first generation, children of immigrants, they are all this under this third culture child syndrome, if you want. Okay.
Yeah.
And an example that I'm aware of, that I know well, is in France, for example, where they have a lot of issues with the children of immigrants, that they are French by birth, right? But because they come from other cultures, they don't feel like they fit, let's say, within the French culture. So in France, they're considered non-French, even though they were born in France and they have the French nationality and stuff. And then when they go to these other countries where their parents are from, they're considered French. They're not considered, and so they suffer an awful lot. And that you talk about a third culture child syndrome is actually very interesting, because if you can manage it, and you understand that your culture, as Amin Malouf says, that your culture is something that you build throughout your life. You add to it. You do not subtract, like you add to it. So if you can manage it, it's a wealth in a sense, but it could also be quite detrimental to your own development. And if you don't manage it well, you could suffer from it. I'm not sure if I made sense, but
no, absolutely beautifully said, and it's very, very true. The children of immigrants, first generation children of immigrants, absolutely have the same exact feelings and experiences, and it is it is because we are not still able to see society as a celebratory approach, as opposed to that othering, that fear, that feeling a disconnect from, someone that we don't relate to. And it continues. And the problem is with the world shrinking and the internet being such an easy access tool, like I said about Saudi Arabia, like all this change and this modernization is happening so rapidly and so fast, we're not addressing the underlying needs to see that evolution stay in a sustainable way. Same thing is happening here with the whole cultural shift in the world. It's kind of creating that inability to really foundationally understand these things in a positive way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for those questions, Mohammed. Thank you so much for your responses,
You're
Jasmine.
welcome.
So before we wrap it up today, Jasmine, I want to make sure that you've had a chance to say everything that you have to say, that you maybe want to let us know where people can follow you or where they can get your book, or any other final words of wisdom that you have for us.
I appreciate that. So I would love to just say a few more things, because I know having these types of conversations, we can go in any direction. I think the foundational message of where, I come from when I have these opportunities to talk and to address these things is one of two things. First is the fact that we have to have these conversations in a safe way without feeling like we are stepping on anyone's toes, where we are potentially going to be attacked or canceled, where from both sides, right? From those of us who really have a lot to share and say and address and call out, and from the folks who are curious and also want to be, kind enough to dance the dance and do a delicate approach to it. So we have to have these conversations. We have to have them civilly, intelligently, honestly, safely, candidly, and all of that. The other piece of the equation, or the side of the coin, is these are realities that are there. They have happened. They're happening to women. They've happened in the past. They continue to happen today. They will continue to happen, and they're not going away. And to utilize this idea and this approach that we want to be kind and compassionate and accepting and tolerant and all the other labels that the West tends to approach, especially the left on the West. And I'm a liberal, but there are deep concerns about how oftentimes these ideologies and philosophies are silencing those of us who have very important things to say. It cannot be comfortable. It's not comfortable. This is ugly stuff we're talking about, and it should not have a political view. It should not have a partisan view. It should not be affiliated with any political, ideological, or social idea. This is like we were saying earlier with Yasmine, this is human rights. This is women's rights. These are fundamental things that continue to happen out in the open and in silence. And for us to pretend that by defending one side, I am deeply allergic to the term Islamophobia. I'm very, very averse to it. I find it extremely damaging, very harmful, very problematic, and very insulting to those of us who have lived experiences that have completely, put us in detrimental situations. I mean, obviously, I came off, slightly better than a lot of others that were pulled into those really drastic situations. And I'm one of the luckier ones, I would say. But to completely invalidate women's experiences because we want to be tolerant, we want to be kind, I draw the line there. And I think we need to be very, very clear about that. Compassion and kindness and tolerance and all that, and having dialogue, goes very far, but at some point it's got to stop, because this has to stop. I'm tired of people telling me and invalidating my lived story because I don't speak with an accent, because I don't come across as someone that has actually grown up there. They assume that I was grown up in the West, or that I'm all of my, way of thinking. Or do not invalidate those of us who have lived these experiences, who have really been through the ringer. We know what we're talking about, and it needs to be validated 10 times more than validating, a religion that is yet to show us where it can really serve women.
Mhm.
Off the soapbox.
No, obviously we need to be supporting humans versus some nameless or some faceless ideology, right? The fact that we're we're more prone to be supporting a faceless ideology versus actual human beings is, I don't know, mind-bogglingly heartbreaking. So yeah, absolutely agree with you, Jasmine. Thank you so much for everything.
course.
And again, Jasmine's book is called The Last Sandstorm. So hopefully if you're interested in learning more about her background and more of what she has to share, then you'll pick that book up. Is it on Amazon, Jasmine, or where can they get it?
Yeah, it's on all platforms. You can find it on all platforms. I have also my website, which is just jasminefalk.com. I'm on Instagram. I'm very active on Instagram. And I want to thank both you, Yasmin and Sada, for having me, for inviting me to come on. Hopefully one of many other opportunities that we will continue to dialogue here. And thank you for all the work that you do also to shed light and to bring attention to this important, very, very important conversation. And thank you all for being here and for your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jasmine. Take care. Take care, everyone. Bye.
After hearing all that, you might be left wondering, what can I do? How can I help? Well, this is why I created a nonprofit called Free Hearts, Free Minds. We are the only organization dedicated exclusively to helping these free thinkers. We empower them with our programs and supportive community, lifting them up so they can heal, speak out, and begin to make positive changes, not just in their own lives, but within the broader community around them. If this is a cause that resonates with you and you want to make a difference, one way to do that is by donating to Free Hearts, Free Minds. Because not enough people care about this cause, we need people like you to help fuel this change. You can donate via our website, freeheartsfreeminds.com. Thank you. Every dollar you donate makes a difference.